Okay, so I've got another idea here. We had on the YouTube videos, there's been a few comments, like people suggesting I'll do another video on the deism versus theism stuff, and I've actually gotten a few uh, messages and emails on the topic lately. So I'm gonna try something. I don't know how this is gonna work. So my favorite Christian apologist, as that goes, is Frank Turek, and this is a copy of Stealing from God. I actually had a chance to talk to him while I was down there, and talked about a few things concerning morality. Didn't have much time to talk to him. It was in Charlotte a few years ago, and there was a big disconnect, I think, on as far as what deism is. And I was hoping to talk with him a little more about it, and I tried emailing him and a few other things. Never was able to get any response, but anyway, I plan on trying to share this video, try to share it, I guess, to his YouTube channel, the Cross-Examine YouTube channel, and see if I can get some kind of response that way. Maybe try to share it on the Facebook page or something, but I doubt anything will happen. There's no reason in particular for him to pay attention to my videos, anyway. So here's what I'm going to do. In order to explore that disconnect between deism and theism, there's a really good point in chapter 1 of this book that actually really is a perfect spot to point out the difference there, the distinction on, and where exactly the whole thought process breaks away. And chapter 1 of this book is causality, which for me is the main argument for God. To me, is the causality argument. And we'll get to morality, I'm sure, and stuff later. But so here's the idea. I'm going to go through this first chapter of Turek's book, and I'm going to go over some of the main points here that are worth going over, and saying, explaining what I don't get about it, some of the things that I get, and stuff like that. But essentially saying what my objections are to some of the thought processes he goes through in this, that lead him from deism to theism. And then share that video and see if anybody has any thoughts on that. And then if people actually are interested, if people actually care, I'll try to do a video for each chapter. What could it hurt? But I need to know that I'm not wasting my time. So hopefully if people watch this and they enjoy it, comment or message me or something. Let me know that this isn't just a waste of time. So anyway, here we go. I'm going to start. I'm going to start just right into the chapter here. So he starts out by talking about this guy that he talked with named John at the University of Michigan. And he goes over his arguments in this discussion. So first thing to notice to me is in this, on page 2, he gets, I say uncontroversial. He refers to the idea that the universe had a beginning as uncontroversial. He says, I say uncontroversial because scientific evidence now is so strong that even most atheists agree that the space-time continuum we call the universe had a beginning. Absolutely on board with that, and I think he's right. I think most people agree. Even some discussions I saw very recently. I'm trying to remember some of the names that were in it, but I don't remember exactly. But I think that is more and more becoming a thing. More and more people are getting on board with the idea that there was a beginning to the space-time idea. And then the argument is, that if it had a beginning. So he lays it out in 3 parts here at the top of page 2. Everything that has a beginning had a cause. Say that's right. That's sort of the law of causality idea. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. Perfectly sound, I think. Here's where it breaks off with me. It's down here. The cause must be enormously powerful. I think that's weird because there's not much to compare it to. I think that's weird language to use as far as describing the first cause of the universe, but who knows? Who knows? So let me right here, while I'm at this spot. So chapter 10 in the Age of Reason. This is how close the thought process is here. I'm going to tell you what Thomas Paine says in chapter 10 of the Age of Reason. He says the only idea man can affix to the name of God is that of a first cause, the cause of all things. And incomprehensibly difficult as it is for man to conceive what a first cause is, he arrives at the belief of it. So it's sort of unavoidable once you realize that everything had a beginning. From the tenfold greater difficulty of disbelieving it. It is difficult beyond description to conceive that space can have no end. But it is more difficult to conceive an end. It is difficult beyond the power of man to conceive an eternal duration of what we call time, but it is more impossible to conceive a time when there shall be no time. And he's getting into some very modern scientific ideas there that Turek gets into in these discussions. So powerful is a weird word to use there, but it's not really anything I would argue about. Here's the part that gets me. He says, and it must be a personal agent in order to choose to create, since an impersonal force has no capacity to choose to create anything. Now, this distinction, in my opinion, this personal-impersonal distinction, is something we know of our observations of the natural world and how it works. The next page here for impersonal forces, which we call natural laws, merely govern what we already created, provided agents don't interfere. So then the agents could be us, right? This is a mold that you try to fit things into in the natural world. And now I want you to just imagine that. Just this distinction between personal and impersonal is something we use to refer to things in the natural world, in nature. Now, imagine this at the bottom of page 3. I want you to keep that in mind. This is where he writes, since nature had a beginning, nature can't be its own cause. The cause must be beyond nature, which is what is meant by the term supernatural. So this sort of betrays the flaw in the idea of trying to force that cause into personal or impersonal. Those are things that we know about nature, and it's trying to fit something that he says at the end of page 3 must therefore by definition exist outside of nature into a defining point in nature. So I can't make that conclusion from all this. Is this personal thing that it required a choice? I don't think that's anything that can be known, because we're already discussing something outside of nature that we can't see. Now, the other thing to point out here is when we're talking about something spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, right? He says this several times, talking about the definition of God being spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, that first cause. I'm well aware as a deist that this poses a problem for both deists and theists. And I still struggle with this, because something that is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial is indistinguishable from something that does not exist. And I still struggle with that all the time. Anytime I try to logically view these things and describe God to myself, I have to fight with that simple fact that, we're talking about something that's supernatural. So I try to get away from that, as I was just saying, the natural things, that trying to fit something into a natural definition. So in the natural world, something that's spaceless, timeless, and immaterial does not exist. Anyway, might come back to that later. So I'm hoping that discussion of personal versus impersonal gets to the point I'm trying to make there. So he gets into this argument about Dr. Lawrence Krauss and what nothing actually is and things like that. It's nothing to do with what we're trying to discuss here. So I'm going to skip forward to page 14. Does causality apply outside of space and time? So he writes about a recent radio debate he had with an atheist. He said we shouldn't claim that the Big Bang had a cause since there was no space-time prior to the creation and the law of causality doesn't apply. Now this is actually a valid point because, and Dr. Turek breaks up this thing and turns it into a syllogism. And I'm going to walk through this and tell you why I think it's not necessarily valid, but it is a sound syllogism. And I don't know what he... So we'll just talk about that. So he breaks it down into three parts. He says atheists who make this claim are saying that there is no efficient cause of the universe because it didn't take place in space-time. Let's look at the argument in a syllogism. First, the law of causality only applies to physical things in space-time. So I don't know if there's necessarily any holes in that, because the law of causality as it's presented is something we understand about the natural universe, and something that we can't know applies to anything outside of the natural universe. The creation of the universe did not occur in space-time. This is the second premise. The creation of the universe did not occur in space-time. It was the creation of space-time. And then the third part is, therefore, law of causality does not apply to the creation of the universe. The problem in this is that I don't know exactly how you can say that the cause, which resulted in time, happened before time. Now, it's weird the language that they use here in these sort of arguments, but essentially, as soon as the cause does anything, time exists. Now he says this argument doesn't work because the first premise is false. He's pointing at the first premise. The law of causality only applies to physical things in space-time. I've already said why I think that's true, because the law of causality is something we understand about the natural world. So he says this argument doesn't work because the premise is false. So I'm thinking as I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, he's going to explain what's wrong with the first premise. But instead, the next thing he says is, notice that there is no physical relationship between premise 1 and 2. The law of causality only applies to physical things in space-time. The creation of the universe did not occur in space-time. Now that is the physical relationship, right? Space-time is the physical part of the premise. It seems to me, anyway. So space-time is the connecting factor between premise 1 and 2. And the conclusion, 3, the argument above, or any argument. Also notice that the premises, and this is another, it's sort of confusing me, the language here. Notice that there is no physical relationship between premises 1 and 2. Okay, premises 1 and 2 and the conclusion. So the conclusion refers to the creation of the universe and the law of causality. It seems to be all connected there. You can take the law of causality out of premise 1 and stick it in the conclusion, and you can take the creation of the universe out of premise 2 and stick it in the conclusion. I have trouble understanding what he's saying here. Premises 1 and 2 and the conclusion, or in any argument. Also notice that premises are not objects in space-time. Yet, there is a causal relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Yet there is a causal relationship between the premise and the conclusion. In other words, true premises result in a valid conclusion. If the above argument were sound, then no argument could be sound. And this is another problem. To me, looking at it, no matter what side of this discussion you fall on, the argument there seems to be sound. So he says, if the above argument were sound, then no argument could be sound. If the law of causality only applied to physical things, then no argument would work because premises and the conclusion are not physical things. Yeah, an argument is not a physical thing. This totally confused me, and I would love to be able to discuss this with him where the problem is, because to me the when you talk about causality, everything that had a beginning had a cause. All this is necessarily temporal. You must have time before these things can apply. So the argument to me seems sound, because to me it doesn't matter whether or not the law of causality applies before the universe existed. If you can say it like that, right? If you can say before time, it doesn't. The semantics there don't matter. But anyway, I would love to discuss that with him further, because I can't follow what angle he's taking there. What was I going to do next? Okay. This one I get a little bit frustrated about. He starts talking about Paul Davies and this. He puts in here about Davies wrote, "All science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered and rational things in an intelligible way. You couldn't be a scientist if you thought the universe was meaningless, was a meaningless jumble of odds and haphazard juxtaposed blah blah. Davies observed that scientists take the orderly laws of physics on faith." This is very frustrating for me, because my education is in science, geology. The observation that these things work the way they are. Take, everybody likes to use gravity, right? Observation of what gravity is an observation and a discovery that's made. We discovered that the universe operates under the laws of gravity. It does not take faith to acknowledge and observe that that's the case and operate accordingly. So to conduct yourself as a scientist accordingly to those discoveries does not take faith. We've discovered that those things are constant. Why those things are constant is a completely different discussion. But that's already been a discovery that's made. It takes no faith to operate, to conduct ourselves according to the discoveries and observations made in science. And this, I don't know if I can actually do this, but what I wanted to do was use this video to sort of explain what I meant, because it really frustrates me when people use the word assumptions in any discussion about science. So I don't know if I can do this or not. I may have to cut this part out of the video if YouTube gets mad at me, but this is what I thought of the minute I read this part of the book. I'm going to play this right quick. It's just a few seconds of it, and then talk about what I'm...
So what goes on here in the Ice Age?
This is obviously
well, one of the things that we're talking about is the Ice Age was generated by the flood. In other words, those who believe in evolution actually believe
I'm
in
sorry,
Ice
so
Ages.
your claim is that there was an Ice Age 4,000 years ago?
The Ice Age was back towards the flood.
What do you
yeah.
base that on?
What do we base that on? Well, as you know...
Here we have evidence for this.
Yeah.
What's the evidence for this?
No, we don't have evidence for that. That's an interpretation. You can't find ice that has labels on it.
Something
Yes, you
about the
can.
secular
Labels?
Absolutely.
That say, I'm 300,000
Yes.
years old? Oh,
Yes, sir, you're a science
never,
educator.
I've never seen one of those. Where do you see
look
one of
and
those?
you count neutrons and oxygen atoms. That's how it's done.
Yeah, but
it's as though it has a label on it. Very much.
But it doesn't say I'm 300,000 years old.
Not in English, no.
No, you have to interpret it on the basis of certain assumptions, right? You have
Or certain
assumptions?
discoveries.
No, assumptions. I mean...
Let's go with discoveries.
No, let's
go
go...
ahead.
Let's
Go ahead. How do you get an ice age
let's-
4,000 years ago?
Let's go with assumptions, because whenever you're interpreting the past, you have to have certain basic assumptions about elements that were there and rates of change and all that sort of thing.
So you're saying, is this your observational science and historical science?
Oh, absolutely.
So
what really, really bothers me is when people talk about operating on a discovery, say, does not require, what's the best way to put this? I like to use the Pythagorean theorem as an example. So before Pythagoras discovered or classified, identified, explained the Pythagorean theorem, how that could be used. It was still true. It was just something that was discovered. Now, to continue to operate in this world and conduct science based on that discovery, that's still true, requires no faith. It's just an observation, an acknowledgement of discovery. Now, if you want to say this is why it is that way, that requires faith. But to say this is the way it is and I can prove it, that does not require faith. This is a very frustrating point for me, and anyway, it frustrates me a lot. And he gets to this. He gets into this with the discussion with between Richard Dawkins and Richard Dawkins and John Lennox. They get into all of that same kind of nonsense. So the next part of it is he talks about design. And I don't like discussing design. I would rather stick to causality, but I wanted to go over some of the stuff that's in, I want to go over everything that's in chapter 1. The intelligent design argument does nothing for me. Nothing. And I'll explain to you why that is. If I can. Hopefully I can articulate this. Maybe. The fundamental flaw in intelligent design for me, and what's fatal in the case of the validity of the argument, is that it views us as a goal rather than an outcome. And that it takes an extremely arrogant and egocentric view of ourselves in order to make that argument. So he makes the tape measure comparison. He talks about, stretching a tape measure across the planet, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but he does the tape measure. Anyway, talk about if you stretched a tape measure across the universe and then said this is where we're at on a certain part of the tape measure, and if you shifted it this much this way or shifted it this much this way, then all of it falls apart. So here's what here's basically the problem with that. I wish I could fine tune. 1 second. Okay. To get your mind around this degree of precision, imagine a tape measure stretched across the entire known universe. If the gravitational force were represented by a particular mark on that tape measure, we wouldn't exist if the force were set off by more than an inch away from where it actually is. Again, that's the scale across, on a scale as wide as the entire universe. So, this is how I've tried to describe this analogy. Let's imagine that I'm throwing a jack. Everybody used to play jacks. I don't know if anybody actually plays that anymore. Let's say we're throwing a jack across a room, and it lands somewhere. Wherever it landed, let's describe the orientation of that jack as the resulting laws of the universe. And what resulted out? What would the outcome of those laws of the universe when you add time in there, or time itself, however you want to view that? Even down to the very atoms from where the floor is in relation to the atoms in the jack. The jack, that outcome, could then look back at me and say, if he had twisted his wrist ever so slightly, if he had just a millionth, if you just a little bit more pressure with the thrust, if the humidity in the room were different, if there was, the sort of thing I'm getting into. There's an infinite number of things that could have gone wrong to where the jack wouldn't landed there. That outcome could make the same argument that I specifically placed it right there in that exact spot. And you could make the argument that if I went over there and tried to put it in that exact spot again, I could never do it because the atoms would then be more offset. That where the jack landed was the outcome. And for the outcome to view that whole process as them being the goal is to shoot an arrow and paint a target around it. It's to each impossibility of the whole idea. If he weren't turned a little bit more the other way, it wouldn't be. So let's draw a big circle around it. Now, if he had put a little more force this way, it wouldn't be this way. So we can draw another circle, slightly smaller around it. And then if maybe the moisture in his hand was different, it wouldn't fly the same way. So we'll draw another smaller ring around it. And you can have this randomly fired arrow and paint a target that's ever drawing in down on it. So, and there's no reason to view the outcome of the universe as anything special. If you were to shift the outcome or that gravity along one way or the other on that tape measure that Turek uses to go across the whole universe, it's just as unlikely that it would have been there as it is where it is. It's just as unlikely that it could be 4 feet down the tape measure as that it is where it is. It's an extremely arrogant thing to say, to imply, right? Turek doesn't say this specifically, but everyone who makes the intelligent design argument is essentially saying any outcome other than an outcome that results in me is an outcome not worth having. There's no possible way the universe could have resulted in anything better than what it's done. An absurd proposition to me. It's absolutely ridiculous. The universe could have created, I'm 100% confident the universe could have created something 1,000,000 times more beautiful than whatever we have now. And, somebody might say, well, it wouldn't be like beautiful by our definition, whatever. I'm just saying that the outcome could have been something far more majestic, far more, awe-inspired than what we've got here. Every time that I've really been able to articulate this with somebody, I have not got a convincing rebuttal to it. To view our outcome as the only one worth having, as the absolute peak of the universe's, of that cause's potential. This is the best it can do. It can't do any better than this, so we must have been the goal. It's so arrogant. It's mind-blowingly arrogant, and it's a false way of operating. I'm hoping that I went through that. That's why the intelligent design argument means nothing to me. He goes over it here, but it means nothing to me. He goes through this discussion between Lennox and Dawkins, and Lennox ventures into the nonsense of the presuppositionalist attitude in some of the things that he says, and it's. I'm not here to talk about Lennox, but he puts this discussion between Dawkins and Lennox in there about, Dawkins says, well, then what caused God? And then Lennox says God had no cause, and all this nonsense. But the main thing I wanted to point out there was that some of the language used there, and some of the language that Turek uses, is that they have to sort of bend this use of the law of causality so that they can refer to God as eternal. Eternal is another thing that depends on the existence of time to even be an applicable word. If there is no time, then eternal is not applicable to that situation. That's why it doesn't work into my definition of what God is. My definition of what God is doesn't venture beyond what Thomas Paine described in chapter 10 of The Age of Reason. It's the first cause. To put anything more than that on God is to presume to know things that you can't know. And that's sort of my takeaway from all this. And I wanted to mention one more thing here on page 27, right near the end. It says both Dawkins and Krauss admit that a respectable case could be made for a deistic God. And then he puts in parentheses, that's a God who created the universe and set up the laws of nature, but does not intervene in the world through miracles. It's kind of surprising to see him describe it that way, because that's actually true. Created's a weird word to use. I like to use the word cause, something to set it all in motion. Created sort of implies, that Earth could just appeared here where it is, instead of going through the natural processes that the rest of the universe goes through before planets can exist. So created's a weird word to use there. But it's a good description, because that's the main part. The universe has set up the laws of nature, but does not intervene in the world through miracles. It's as though he completely missed this when we talked in Charlotte. The language that he used to talk about deism was way off base. And that's something that I would also like to discuss with him and clear up. Then he says, that's a huge admission. There's a massive leap from atheism to deism, but a short step from deism to theism. It is a massive step as well. And that's one of the things that I try to drive home in these videos, is that it's a huge step that can't be made thinking logically, in my opinion. Okay. So, I'm going to upload this. If it gets some reaction, if it starts some discussions, we'll do chapter 2. Which is that chapter on reason. So, if you watch this and you want more videos, then please say so somehow, so I know that I'm not wasting my time. And I'll do one video per chapter and go through. I think some of the chapters may not apply to the deism versus theism discussion, but a lot of them do. If it goes well, then this will be the next one. It's super frustrating, but if you know me, you know I like to talk about morality and the God of the Bible. So this will be the one that I'll get into. If this goes good, that'll be the next book. And I know Turek recommends this book a lot. I've seen him recommend it a few times, in person and in YouTube videos. So, watch this. Maybe this video will make it to Turek and he'll watch it and give me his thoughts. That would be amazing. But like I said, there's no reason really for him to feel the need to reply to me. But if he does, then that would be very much appreciated. And my thanks to Dr. Turek, because this book is still, even though I'm going to be going through it and giving my opinion of it, this is still really good writing. And I really enjoyed reading this book. So I appreciate it. Please let me know what you think.